Welcome to episode 224, Building Better Boundaries, Insights for Fostering Healthy Relationships in Clients, featuring Kristina, registered clinical counselor. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and today I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have about boundaries and how we clinicians can conceptualize and support our clients in developing better boundaries. Today, joining us, we have Kristina. She is a registered clinical counselor joining us from Canada. Thank you so much for coming on today, Julia.
Thank you for having me. I am excited to talk about this.
Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how this topic became so important to you?
Yeah, great question. So I am a registered clinical counselor. I started off working for the health board after I graduated from grad school and then moved into a private practice. And it actually took me a little while to figure out that that's not true. I knew from the time I was 14 years old that my calling was to be a therapist, but I was someone who had convinced myself that I'm not academic enough to get a master's degree. So I did a lot of messing around in my early 20s and, trying different things to avoid going to grad school. And then one day there was this very sort of serendipitous moment where I was resolved to do whatever it took to become a therapist. And thinking, as many of us therapists do, that I was going to be a therapist to help other people. And then as you go through the process and as you're in school and as you're learning all this stuff, your own layers of your own onion start to get peeled back and you start to realize I really am, as they talk about, one of those wounded healers. So many of us are, we're drawn to the things that are most relevant and personal to us, which then kind of tying this all together with the boundaries thing, picking up randomly one day, one of the classics that if you're in this field, you know it well, a book by Harriet Lerner called The Dance of Anger. And reading that book, and that was my very first introduction to this idea that me as a person could have my own wants, needs, and opinions that were different from the ones that were expected of me from my family of origin, and starting to really see that I came from quite an enmeshed codependent family. And it was all starting to make sense why I didn't really have a sense of self for most of my life until I actually picked up this book and started looking more into it. And I think I was 30 years old at the time where I finally realized that so many of my issues that I was struggling with was because I had no idea what a boundary was. And it just sucked me right in. And I started to just get immersed in this world of boundaries and healthy boundaries and why we need boundaries and the difference it makes for our own sense of self and the quality of our relationships. And from there, the rest is history. The first course that I ever created was called Healthy Boundaries Boot Camp, and bringing people through a 6-week intensive on learning all about why they need boundaries and where they need boundaries and how to set, establish, and maintain those boundaries and why it's so important for our mental health and well-being. And so here we are, how many years later, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about and teach about.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for coming and joining us. As we record this in 2024, boundaries has become one of those social media buzzwords. Can you spend a moment and kind of deconstruct what is a boundary and what are we talking about and what are we not talking about?
Thank you. Oh my gosh, but this is the best question because I'm going to hopefully totally flip your brain about what a boundary is. And it's going to make it so much more clear. And when we do start to set boundaries, and we do start teaching people about boundaries, it's going to make it so much more effective. So boundaries are not about changing anybody else. They're not about requiring anybody else to do anything any different. They are a request for change. They are a request for modification. They are a request for consideration. Now, because we can't control anyone, believe me, I have tried. I can't even control my 9-year-old son. But we can't control anyone. So if we are relying on other people's words or actions or behaviors in order for us to be okay, then we are outsourcing our own well-being into the hands of someone else who is nowhere nearly as concerned about our well-being as we are, because nobody else is going to be as affected by our well-being as we are. So if we could see that a boundary is about making a request for a change or a modification, and then depending on how that person chooses to respect and adhere to that, we make our own choices for our behavior, right? So instead of saying, you need to stop yelling at me, no, they don't need to stop yelling at you. You would like them to stop yelling at you. So saying, I would like you to stop yelling at me. And if you don't, I am going to remove myself from this conversation, from this room, from this building, whatever it is. So you can continue on yelling all you want. I can't stop that. I can't control that. But this is what I can do to take care of me, right? And so I remember years ago when my children were young and my parents were helping us out with childcare, which was wonderful and amazing and so generous of them. But it was also very stressful because I had to get down to my office to see clients, and they would come into town to take care of my daughter and they'd always be late. And it would be so stressful for me because I'm like, I have to get out of the house at this time. They'd always have a reason. And so finally I said, I need you to be on time. You cannot be late. But of course they can be late. They can come whenever they want, and I can't control that. And so what I started doing is saying, okay, because I would walk downtown. I would walk down to my office. And it was about a 40-minute walk. And that was part of my ritual for preparing myself mentally and just getting myself in the zone. Because at that time I was seeing 7-8 clients back to back in a day. And I really needed to make sure I was in a good headspace, not stressed, not rushing. And so I said, it's your choice to be late. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start walking with the baby in the stroller. Call me when you're in town. Call me when you're close by. You can come meet me where I'm at and I'll transfer everything into your car. So there it is. I can't make you come on time, but this is what I can do. I can leave when I need to leave, and you can come and find me, and we'll do it from there. Because I couldn't change them. And it actually ended up working out well because it stopped me from being so stressed. It stopped them from feeling rushed. It stopped this kind of friction in the relationship where they'd show up late and I'd be running out of the house trying not to lose my mind because, my parents are coming to help out with childcare. I don't want to yell at them, but also this is not working well. And so that was their choice to come late. That was my choice to arrange it like that. So do you see how it's you can do whatever you want. What do I need to do in this situation so that I am not feeling trapped, frustrated, resentful, angry, hurt? Your choice, my choice. And if we can start to see boundaries like that, it's going to make them so much more easier and effective to be set and kept.
I really like not only the way you explained that, but also the example. So thank you for sharing that. In thinking about boundary setting, I can see someone saying, okay, let's go back to yelling. That idea of I can't stop you from yelling, and understand that if the yelling continues, I will be leaving. I will end this conversation. I'm going to need to leave. I can see the possibility that gets flipped into, is that a threat?
Yeah, no, that is a assertion of choices, right? You're going to choose to yell. I'm going to choose to not stay in the room for it. No problem. Do what you need to do, right? And I give this other example because this is something that comes up surprisingly frequently, is parents, grandparents stopping by. And for a lot of people, especially, for moms, for a lot of moms, in-laws, or even their own parents, mothers, stopping by is an issue. Stopping by unannounced, and a stressful issue, especially when the expectation that, she drops everything when this guest arrives and caters to them, and how this can be very stressful. And so, I've worked with clients, I've talked to a lot of people that are I've told her, please don't stop by unannounced. Please call me first. Please just at least let me know, right? Give me the heads up, or just make sure that I'm free, or ask me what time would work. This is really hard. And then, mothers, as we sometimes do, are just like, you're my child. I can do whatever I want, right? Like, you don't tell me what to do. I birthed you. Even though you're an adult, you don't really have your own life. You're my child. Anyways, and so we talked about this and being like, okay, well, how about, setting your boundary. You can't say you can't stop by, because of course you can stop by, but you can say, I'm not going to answer the door. You are welcome to stop by. I love you very much. I love spending time with you. I do not love it when it's sprung on me, when it's unannounced, when I'm not prepared for it. I haven't put this time aside for it. I would really like to put the time aside for it so I can be present with you, not feel stressed or distracted. And so if there isn't this conversation beforehand, then you are welcome to stop by. I will not be answering the door, right? Your choice, my choice. So we've made it clear. I would like to spend time with you. I would like to see you. It does not work for me when you come by unannounced and I'm unprepared and it's stressful and it's difficult. I can't give you my attention. So I will not do this anymore. You can do whatever you want, but I won't do this.
Thank you for that example. In today's conversation, we're going to be going kind of lots of places with this, but to follow where we are right now, what is occurring to me is like, so there's the setting of the boundary, which is you can come over, I will not answer. Then there's the actual implementation and holding of the boundary, which is the other part of the work. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Ooh, can I ever? The truth is, we know this from classical behavioral psychology, is that in order for a behavior to get extinguished, we just have to not give it the stimulus, right? The stimulus, the pleasurable response. We have to not give the stimulus the response that it's looking for only a few times before the behavior itself becomes extinguished, right? Using a lot. I'm glad I'm speaking to clinicians because they know all this like jargon. So think of it like this. If you're in line up at the grocery store with your children and they are asking for a chocolate bar, and if you're like, no, we're not buying candy in line, this is not going to go well, I'm not going to sugar up my kids, or especially not if they're throwing a tantrum about it. And so you say like, no candy in line. I will not buy it. And they kick and they scream and they throw a fit and they tell you they're the meanest mom. And then you're like, okay, fine. Because you want to stop the discomfort or the embarrassment or whatever it is. And you give in, right? That's the reinforcement. That you've reinforced bad behavior. You've given them a reward for the behavior that you don't want. And so what are they going to do next time? Be like, well, maybe I shouldn't ask this time because I got what I wanted when I put up a fuss last time. No, that's not the way the human brain works. And be like, I'm going to get it again. All I have to do is kick and scream a little bit. I don't have to listen. Even though she says no, she doesn't really mean it. So I'm just going to do what I need to do to get what I want to get. However, if you say no the first time and the child's like, what? You've done it before. You've not said anything before. You've said no, but then you do it anyways. And now you're saying no, this cannot happen. I will get what I want. I will kick and I will scream and I will put up a whole scene. But if you hold your ground and say, I am sorry you are upset about this, but this is not happening and it's for a good reason. You don't have to like the reason or agree with the reason, but I do, and I'm the one with the money. So that's what's happening. And then you have to tolerate, we're going to talk about strategies to tolerate that extreme discomfort that comes up when we start to set a boundary and we get that resistance, that unhappiness, that protest, that those passive aggressive underhanded remarks, and holding to it. And you only have to do it a few times consistently before the behavior becomes extinguished, before the person knows I'm not going to get what I want when I engage in this. So unconsciously, not even a conscious decision, but unconsciously, I'm not going to waste the effort trying to get what I want when I won't get it. So it's just classic behavioral change in that. But for us as the new boundary setters, it's that middle part of the, holy cow, I just set a boundary. This person's not going to like it. This is going to create some waves. This is going to messing with the system. This is not like going to work for this person is going to not enjoy this very much. But this is why I take you through a process to teach clients on what to do when that discomfort comes up in order to hold it. Because the truth is, again, we only have to do it a couple times before the host gets bored.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing that so head on. Boundaries mean different things to different people. The ways that we set boundaries, where we set them, when we hold them, like these are highly individual and also sometimes highly cultural. Of like what is okay in one family system may be majorly frowned upon in another. Can you speak to that element of boundaries and kind of the sociocultural consideration because it's different for different people?
Yeah. So again, there isn't like a set thing. You have to set boundaries here with this person in this circumstance in these ways. Absolutely not. So what we want to be doing is really checking in with people and getting them to be aware of how they know a boundary has been crossed and where their individual boundaries are, right? So we want to be really helping people tune in, and how we can start to help them tune in is a really clear sign that there are boundaries being crossed is that someone is feeling resentful, controlled, burnt out, overwhelmed, unappreciated, run over, insignificant, unimportant. So if people can start to look at, okay, these are the things that I am feeling. Where am I feeling them and with whom? And then we start to uncover that and start to look at, okay, why is this feeling this way? What has been happening in this relationship? Has that been impacting me? And is there an opportunity here to be changing that dynamic in the relationship by changing how we are approaching or responding to things in this particular relationship? And now again, we're not going to go and like throw it all up in the air and, just like completely destroy the whole ecosystem of the relationship, but we are going to start to pay attention. What's not feeling quite right here? And again, in different cultural contexts, that's going to be different. What someone might be okay in a certain culture, they might be like, yeah, that's totally fine with me that my friends just come and just like stay at my house and crash on my couch indefinitely. That's fine. My house is their house, or family, or whoever it is. And someone else would be like, oh my gosh, that's a huge boundary violation. That is just like not okay. But there's no such thing as not okay and okay objectively, right? These are just behaviors. These are just circumstances. These are just things that are happening. And it's going to be the individual brain that's going to decide whether or not it's okay or not okay with them. And so really starting to tune into ourselves. What doesn't feel like it's working here? How am I feeling in this relationship? Is there a way it could be different? And so especially, this is not going to be so easy, especially if you came from a very enmeshed family. And there was really no differentiation of self, and everyone was just sort of intermixed, intertwined. There wasn't like, it's like group think, right? There's not space for like individual think. It's all what's the expectation of the group, how we do things, what our expectation is, what you're supposed to do, the role that you play. And there's not really a space for deviation from that individual thought, individual preference. Or similarly, different side of the coin, similar idea is in a high control. If you grew up in a high control family where your wants, needs, and preferences and individuality, where there wasn't space for that, right? This is what you do. This is how you do it. This is the expectation. You need to fulfill this. This is who you need to be. And so really looking at that and looking at yourself as an adult and being like, okay, what doesn't feel okay about that anymore? And I know that things are not working for me if I am, feeling like we talked about, feeling resentful, feeling trapped, feeling like I don't know myself, feeling like I don't know my place, feeling like I don't have space to be myself in any particular relationship, that my wants, needs, or preferences don't matter, feeling controlled in any kind of relationship. And that's how we know, regardless of cultural context, that there's an issue here that I need to deal with. Not that they need to change, but that I need to address.
That boundary setting and then the subsequent potential holding of boundaries can often send shockwaves through a system. Can you talk about, like you mentioned, enmeshed, high control? Like, let's talk about some of these systems and zoom in on how they may respond to boundaries, and then also what a client could expect. I know in working with clients around boundaries, chances are if we're not used to this, we're not going to start doing the big stuff first. Or if we try, we might quickly backpedal and go, whoa, what just happened? And so it's, through these smaller changes and starting to kind of work the clay of the system, if you will. But can you speak to kind of the family and systemic context of boundary setting and the changes that happen as a result?
So I was 32 years old, so kind of 2 years into my healthy boundaries setting journey. Was the first time I really remember setting a profound boundary for me. And I have this very salient memory of it. I was at my sister's house for Christmas. My parents were at my brother's house. My sister and brother live a couple blocks from each other in Saskatchewan. So 2 provinces over, we had taken a flight there for the holidays. And at the time, my daughter I think she was about a year old. And we had been doing family stuff, as you do over the holidays, one person's house to the next, to the next, to the next, all these activities, all these things happening. And I was exhausted. And there was this one night over the holidays. It wasn't Christmas or New Year's or Boxing Day. It wasn't any special day, but we were all just going to go over to my brother's house, and he was going to order some takeout for everyone to come and hang out there. And I just remember dreading it and being like, I am so tired. I just need a night off. But then also thinking, well, I'm not allowed to do that. I'm not allowed to have a night off. I'm not allowed to take a rest because this is what the family is doing.
This is what we do.
This is what we do. It didn't even, and then I was like, oh, but I've been doing this boundary work and I've been learning about this. And I'm actually allowed to have my own limits and my own preferences. And I don't know if I'm actually allowed to, but a lot of people with a lot of letters beside their name say that I am. And so I was like, you know what? I said that to my mom, you know what, Mom, I'm going to sit this one out. I'm just going to stay back and just hang out and have a quiet evening, maybe just watch a movie, just chill. And she looked at me with these eyes that were just like shocked, not angry. My mother's a lovely person, but just like, oh, well, this is what we're doing tonight. And I was like, yeah, but no one ever actually asked me. And it's just not something that works for me tonight. And so I'm going to stay back and do this. And she's like, well, Paul will be so upset. He'll be so hurt. And I was like, well, Paul didn't actually invite me and ask me if I wanted to come. And if he had, I would have said, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to pass on this one. And so it is not my intention to hurt, upset or disappoint anyone, but this is what I need to do for myself. I will let Paul know and send my regrets. You guys go and have a wonderful evening. And she was like, oh, okay. And you better believe they all talked about me at the dinner table that night. Julia and her boundaries. I remember this coming like, oh, there goes Julia setting her boundaries again. And it was like this 4-letter word coming out of their mouth that like, how dare you? And so if you can think of a family system, it's a system. No matter how it functions, a family is a system. And it's like these cogs in a factory that are all kind of intertwined and intermingled. And, it's functioning in its dysfunction, even if it's clunky, even if it's like, throwing sparks or blowing smoke or, kind of on the verge of breakdown, it's still functional in its dysfunction. And then you, as your newfound boundaried self, starts to change that. You're pulling yourself out of this functional dysfunction, and the whole thing goes into complete chaos because you've pulled out a cog. And when there is chaos, there is discomfort. And we know that human beings, our number one goal is to move towards pleasure and away from pain. And so if there is pain happening, we want to resolve this pain. The system wants to resolve this different sensation and get it back to the status quo as quickly and easily as possible. And so doing that is going to be a lot of attempts to pull you back into this dysfunction. You're being so selfish. You're being so difficult. Who do you think you are? The mockery, like, there goes Julia and her boundaries. Or, oh, you think that you're the only one that matters? Or, like, where do you get off, right? Well, I guess you can do that. And I guess I'll just have to figure it out on my own. I guess I'll just have to try and find someone else. Right. And so the guilt tripping, the name calling, the passive aggressiveness, the little underhanded jabs, these are all attempts, not to say that you are doing something wrong, but you have created tension and discomfort in the other participants in the system. And they're not mean or horrible, awful people by doing this. They are uncomfortable people that are trying to regain their predictable discomfort as opposed to this new unknown discomfort. And so we want to go with and stay with what we know and how things have been going. So there's going to be a lot of attempts to bring you back into the system. So you can see that resistance not as you doing something wrong, but as the system trying to correct itself by reintegrating you into that. And understanding that the more you kind of keep yourself outside of that messy system and really holding firm, being your individual self, creating that healthy interdependence, establishing that strong, secure, grounded sense of self, and letting the chaos do what it needs to do, but you not being involved in it, the more the chaos will either kind of go back to its dysfunction without you, or what actually happened in my family is that my siblings started to be like, you mean we're allowed to have boundaries? We're allowed to not just go along with what mom and dad want and think all the time. We don't have to fulfill their expectations of us. We don't have to actually make them proud at our own personal expense and well-being. And then my sister started going to therapy and learning about having her own boundaries. And then my brother started it. And they were two of my biggest adversaries at the beginning. And now my relationship with both of them has never been better, because there is this mutual respect for each person in the relationship, having wants, needs, preferences, and a say. And so really looking at this as long-term relationship preserving and protecting, because what often happens in families when there's estrangement or cutoffs, it's because people have gotten fed up with having themselves not treated the way they want to be treated, not respected the way they want to be respected, not heard the way that they want to be heard, and then laying down those ultimatums and then having to resort to alienation and cutoff in order to deal with the issue. Now, I'm not saying that alienation is always terrible. Sometimes it's necessary, especially in situations where there's abuse, where there's harm being created. But a lot of times people use cutoffs as a form of anxiety management because the person isn't being or acting or responding in the ways that we want. We don't know what else to do.
Thank you. You covered a lot of really helpful information there. And again, I appreciate your example to kind of illuminate what you're talking about. Going back to what you'd said earlier about that unintentional reinforcement, it sounds like to me, if you're working with a client who's decided that they want to set these boundaries and they've thought about it and the potential consequence, it's for us as clinicians to provide education about there's going to be blowback, going to warn you, here's what's probably going to happen. But then also it's anticipating, kind of pre-planning, how are you going to manage that when your boss says, oh, well, then I guess that promotion can't happen. It's what's that going to be like? What if that's this consequence? It becomes this other threat, to kind of talk through the eventualities as a way to help manage that anxiety. Because for someone who's not used to setting that many boundaries, it's like a terrifying undertaking.
Yeah, it really is. If we can look at boundaries as boundaries don't mean that I am trying to be mean, that I am trying to be punishing, that I am trying to hurt or harm. Boundaries just mean that I am clear, right? So boundaries don't mean that I am mean. Boundaries mean that I am clear, and they are not there to destroy relationships. They are there to preserve and help build healthier ones. So if we don't see boundaries as a reaction against you, right? So boundaries are not against that person. Boundaries are for me. They're for my own preservation and protection and well-being. And it's not to hurt or harm you. It is for me. So if we could take this approach and this mindset when we're going into setting boundaries, it's going to change how we do it. And so instead of saying, you can't do this, or I just need to do this, we have a conversation and being able to sit down with your boss and say, you have been giving me a lot lately, and I have been doing a really good job at getting it all done. It has come at an extreme cost to my personal health and well-being and the quality of the relationships in my family. And I cannot sustain that. It is important to me to do a good job, to be a valued member at the team, but it cannot come at the cost of my mental health and my physical health. You can have an honest conversation with boundaries, right? Just sit down and be real. Being able to say like, this is really hard for me, or this is having this impact on me. And can we make this change? Or I would really like to still get that promotion. Is there a way that we can work it so that I can still be on that track for that promotion, by also not sacrificing my mental well-being and my family for the sake of it? And, hopefully your boss is human enough to be able to say, yeah, I think we can do that. Right. And if they're not, then it might be time to find another job. Right. But it's also really like, let's just have these more honest conversations with people instead of just being like, this is my boundary. Right. Like, I will not do this. I refuse to do this, because that creates separation. That creates frustration. That creates distance and resentment in the relationship. But if we can sit down and say, this is what I need to do and why, this is what I need to do and why I need to do it. Can we work together on this? Right.
In the way that you just positioned that, it also reminds me kind of Dear Man, coming from dialectical behavior therapy, of describe, access, assert, and reinforce, and kind of working on that assertive communication. And in thinking about this too, we talked about it a little bit, kind of the cultural considerations, but this challenge of communicating this way, of being clear with ourselves and then potentially with the outside world or somebody in our lives about these boundaries, is highly shaped by the way that our world treats us. I'm thinking back to past conversations that we've had on the podcast, talking about alexithymia, for example, and that many marginalized people have difficulty acknowledging how we're feeling and then kind of doing anything about that because it's been conditioned into us. For people who have one or multiple marginalized identities, it's a big charge to imagine having that conversation with your mom, with a boss, with a partner, with your neighbor. How do you work with clients that have historically, that come from identities that have historically not been permitted to have boundaries? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. And I think another category that is an important one, especially when it comes to boundaries, is adult children of alcoholics. Because there's a big issue there with, it's a lot of psychological abuse. There's a lot of belittling. There's a lot of unpredictability. There's a lot of denial of self. And so it can kind of go along with a lot of these other kind of cultural contexts of this is your role. This is who you need to be. What you want, need, think, and feel doesn't matter, right? You are a subordinate. Your job is to make me proud. Your job is to hold up the family's reputation. Your job is to save face. Your job is to just smile and nod.
Be seen and not heard.
Yeah, be seen and not heard. You don't have a right to have an opinion. You don't have a right to have a say. You don't even have a right to have needs, for goodness sakes, right? And maybe it's not even overtly said, and maybe sometimes it is, but it's just sort of that feeling. And so this is why this boundary journey is a longer journey, and really kind of establishing a sense of self and helping clients to start to connect with themselves. And sometimes it has to start there before anything else, back to the basics. Let's do some self-connection work. Who are you? What do you actually like? How do these different things make you feel? What's okay with you? What's not okay with you? What do you wish you could tell people? What do you not like when people do? What do you wish you could ask for? How do you wish you could spend your time and your energy if it was completely up to you? What kinds of things do you often find yourself having to keep your mouth shut about? What do you worry will happen if you actually did speak up or say something or insert yourself into this conversation? Right? And just starting to get those sensitizing questions. How do we sensitize ourselves and become more sensitive to ourselves, to our feelings, to our desires, to what's working, what's not working, and really just helping people. I remember in my 20s when someone would be tell me about yourself, I would freeze up. I'm I don't know. What do you want to know? I don't know myself. I don't know. I like to sing and dance, right? I think, and this is what I do, right? And how often do we find ourselves when someone says, tell me about yourself, we default to what we do, to the roles that we play, because that's easy to identify. And when someone says, tell me about yourself outside of your roles, so many of us who have come from these enmeshment or high control and have no sense of self feel like deers caught in the headlights, like, I don't even know what to say, right? And so first and foremost, if we are dealing with someone who just really, there has been really no space for self in the family, in the relationship, let's start there. And then we can move into what kind of boundaries make sense for me to start with. Maybe it's as simple as being invited to a family gathering and turning down the invitation. And for some people, that's like, Julie, that's not simple. That would be the hardest thing in the world. But for a lot of people, that is, especially with the holidays coming up, for a lot of people, that seems very tangible to be like, yeah, like I am going to practice declining one invitation that maybe wouldn't have like a super high cost to declining, right? And wouldn't have a big impact on other people to decline. And so I wouldn't have to sit with all of that, but I could just exercise my human right to make my own choices in this low stakes way.
As we're talking about this too, I'm also thinking about different kinds of relationships. And I want to throw it out there. We're also talking right now about relationships that are not based in a foundation of abuse. And so consideration about boundaries is going to be different if the context is, the potential for neglect, for abandonment, for any type of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, financial abuse. And so as I'm thinking about it, it's like, yes, boundaries, working around that, understanding it, understanding self, and also like playing out, what are your plans? Is there any risk to safety? Because I was thinking about the conversation that I'd had on the podcast with LaShonda Sugg, and she had said, much to what you had said a moment ago, we are accustomed to saying like, I don't like that. And that one thing that she's done from a trauma-informed perspective is to say, okay, when I'm saying that, or that's how I'm feeling, it's like, I don't feel safe. And it's like, so let's talk about that safety component and lean into that. And also become aware of like, what have been the past consequences of trying to set or hold boundaries, and how has that in the past resulted in some kind of trauma or violence for you, and how does that change your relationship to it now, and in the context of your current relationships, what is safe?
Absolutely. Well, and then we have to go back to Maslow's hierarchy, right? Like our first need is for safety, right? And we have to be safe in order to start moving into these like more like establishing self and connection with self and self-discovery. But we have to be safe to do that before we move into that. So absolutely really looking at that first.
Thank you. When considering individualistic, like typical quote unquote Western cultures and more collectivistic cultures, how do you feel like that comes into play in working with clients that come from these really different marinades?
Absolutely. And that's an important thing too. That's why boundaries aren't going to be across the board for everyone. So it's really just in a collective culture being like, I would still like to have a sense of self within the group. I'm not planning to like separate myself from the group. I'm not planning to take myself completely outside of the group think or the group expectations, but I would also want to be a little bit more connected to myself within this system. I'm not planning to leave the system. I'm not planning to, take myself away from the system forever. I just want a little bit more of a sense of self and connection to self within this system, within this dynamic. I'm not going to overhaul the whole thing, but I would like to make some modifications, right? And so this comes up a lot, especially with adults caring for their aging parents, to be like, like I have to care for my mother. Like, I'm not just going to say like, this is too much for me. This is too stressful. This is too overwhelming. I can't do it. This is my boundary, right? Like, no, I'm not going to leave my mother high and dry, even though it's tiring and draining and difficult and overwhelming for me. But what are my choices within that to make those things less so? There's always room for adjustment in any relationships without it having to be a complete overhaul. And so how can I make this work better, even if it's not going to be perfect for anyone, right? How do I make this less bad? And sometimes we're not going for best. We're
We're
not
going for
going
less
for
bad.
ideal. We're going for less bad. And that's okay, right? Because sometimes we don't have choices over our circumstances. We can't control our circumstances, but we always have choices within them. And it is naive to think that you have complete jurisdiction over every area of your life at any point. I mean, you do, but there will be consequences to that you may not want to, like, just honestly, like, it will be worse for me. It will be worse for me to make this choice than it will for me to just keep going along with the status quo. Right. And so that is a decision. And there's no right or wrong. And that's the thing. It's like, it's not like, well, you have to have these boundaries. You don't have to do anything as a human, right? Nobody has to do anything. And I really learned this, like, so clearly when I first started my career working as a concurrent disorders counselor in one of the, poorest, most marginalized populations in all of Canada on the downtown east side of Vancouver, like right in there in the middle of it all. And, as soon as we say, like, I have to change, or this person has to change and they have to do it like this, no, they absolutely do not. We are allowed to keep ourselves in dysfunction. We're allowed to keep ourselves in pain. We're allowed to keep ourselves in discomfort. We're allowed to keep ourselves just sort of not doing anything for our own personal growth, right? It doesn't make you a worse person. There's no value judgment here. It's just, what do you want? And what are the pros and cons and the consequences and benefits to those things? So we're going into each decision that we make and each change that we want to make consciously and aware of what we are doing, why we are doing it, and what we might come up against in the process, and continue to think that despite that, it is worth it.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because I think that's an important point to consider. Part of the way I've heard it described it before, part of trauma is when we have a lack of control, when we can't influence the outcome. And particularly for people, for whatever reason, because of their system, because of their culture, so many different factors that don't have control, that don't feel a sense of flexibility, don't have the option for it, then asking for it, requesting it, can be really scary and disorienting for people around them. And I appreciate what you're saying, which is like, let's look at each person and also like what is within your realm of control. And using, again, pulling from dialectical behavior therapy, my brain went to like using wise mind to like kind of sit down and break down, well, if I do this, if I set this boundary, what are some of the potential consequences, knowing that we couldn't possibly as a clinician be able to label every single one, but to give the space to think through that, and observe, is this thing, when I say yes to that request, is that working for me? Is it not? If I say no, what do I think would have happened? If I say no next time, what might happen? And am I ready and prepared for that potential consequence? I think there's a lot of wisdom kind of in that space making, and that idea of a client being the ultimate decider about what works for them, and not this idea of like, well, you need to set better boundaries. And it's like, well, that's really for any of us to decide of what works for me in my culture, in my context, understanding that that's individual for me. So I appreciate what you were just saying there and kind of reinforcing that fact. Can you speak about different types of healthy boundaries, kind of as we're conceptualizing, what do boundaries look like, and where do they pop up?
Yep. So we actually have 6 different types of boundaries. And they are physical boundaries. So defining kind of your personal space, your touch preferences, and your physical needs like rest, food, and privacy. So what am I kind of doing to preserve and protect my physical well-being? The next one is our emotional boundaries. So those involve setting limits around your emotions, your time, and your energy. So what do you have the actual mental and emotional capacity for? What are you available for emotionally? What are you not available for emotionally? Being able to say things like, I'm just not comfortable sharing that, or I need a break from this conversation, or I'm just not feeling the best right now. I need to kind of take a little time to center, to ground, to regroup. Then there's our time and energy boundaries. And these ones are about protecting your time and energy by prioritizing your commitments. So if you are like me, you really like to say yes because you really don't want to let anyone down. But then, it's what sounds great at first to commit to all these things quickly becomes all of this like anxiety producing pressure to be like, holy cow, how am I going to get this all done? How am I going to keep up with this? It's just like looking at your calendar at the beginning of the week, you're having heart palpitations. I mean, like I have taken on too much. And it's not always coming from a bad, from a bad place. It's not always about people pleasing or, feeling this huge sense of obligation. It can come from just a real desire to be involved in all these things. And then being like, I have overcommitted myself and overwhelmed myself. So what do I need to do to be taking a step back to really be honest with myself about what my capacity is and what is going to allow me to look at my week feeling excited instead of dreading, right? And so how do I want to do this? And this can also be like if a friend's like, oh, can you come and help me, move this weekend, right? It doesn't always have to be like a yes to no end. You can have a yes with parameters, right? And that's another form of boundaries where it's not always this black and white yes or no. It can be a yes, but with some stipulation, with some edges in there, right? You can have a yes with edges, absolutely. Saying, yes, I would absolutely be happy to come, not happy, willing to come and help you move. I'm available from 3:00 to 6:00 on Saturday. Does that work for you? Or if you're more flexible, I'm available. I can give you 3 hours of my time this weekend. When would be best? Right? So you see how we're like, oh, this is a boundary, but it's also not so rigid, right? Learning, and this is another nuance that we get better at as we set our boundaries, is becoming kind of flexible within those boundaries. At first, we may need to swing the pendulum to the other direction and just have a policy of no or a policy of the let me get back to you, right? And so really working with clients, I do this with a lot with clients, is really teaching them how to say, let me get back to you, especially for people that have a hard time saying no right off the bat. And that makes them very uncomfortable. Start with just giving yourself some time and space to process. So you're not going to say yes. You're not going to say no. You're going to say, let me get back to you. And then you're going to take time, maybe even make another session with your therapist and sit down and talk about, okay, what is happening here? What do I need? How do I feel? How can I approach this? And really just sort of giving yourself that time and space to work it out before you give a response. And of course, not being one of those people that's like, I don't know, let me see, and then never responding, because that's not good for relationships either. But saying, let me get back to you, and then actually taking the time to sort yourself out and then come back with a well thought out response and an intentional response, and then doing that. Our next category of boundaries is sexual boundaries. So what is your comfort around sexual activities? What is okay with you in the bedroom? What is okay with you in different relationships? What kind of touch you prefer? What kind of touch gives you the ickies, right? And just being able to say like what's okay with you and what's not okay with you. This one tends to be a difficult one for especially people socialized as women, because we have been taught for generations that our needs are secondary. Our preferences are secondary. Our job, our role as females is to please men and to not upset men and to respect their desires, because their desires are strong and that's what we're here for. And so it can bring up a lot of discomfort if you're getting that like kind of, long held kind of cupping grasp on the small of your back from your boss. What do you say in that situation? Right? And so this is when we start to pay attention, like, you know what? That feels a little too personal, right? And just being able to say like, let's just have a little bit more space here. That feels a little personal, right? Or, I'm not someone who really loves to be touched, right? And like it can be, but again, like taking those things into consideration, if I say to this person, please don't touch me like that, that is inappropriate and you crossed a boundary. Again, that could have a consequence that you don't want, where you could end up like randomly getting demoted because whatever reason, or getting, kind of the worst assignments, or getting fired, like heaven forbid it, they came up with some kind of reason, right? Like understanding that yes, a lot of times our boundaries can have significant, very detrimental consequences to us, which is why we have to learn more of the art behind it, as opposed to thinking that it's this, foolproof science, because it absolutely is not. But it has to start with getting to know and being okay was saying, I don't like comments like that. That makes me feel icky. I don't like touches like that. That makes me uncomfortable. Even when it comes to safe relationships with their partners, being able to say, I don't like being touched like that, right? Like that just doesn't feel good. It just, even if it doesn't feel violating, it just doesn't feel good. And I don't like it. So really learning where our sexual boundaries are, where our physical intimacy boundaries are. The next one is intellectual boundaries. So these are boundaries to protect your thoughts and your beliefs and your opinions. And this is really about preventing other people from belittling or dismissing your ideas, and encouraging respectful dialogue. And so being able to say clearly, I don't like it when you use that tone with me. I don't like it when you talk to me that way. It feels like you think that you are better than me or smarter than me. Could you please speak to me in a more respectful way? I don't like it when you come in as if your opinion is the truth, when sometimes you're actually wrong. But you come in with this full-blown opinion and statement that you're stating as ultimate truth, but it's not. And it really bothers me. And he has come back and said, you know what? I am sorry. You're right. But I'm like, could you just be a little bit softer in your approach? And he's a wonderful human being and very like open, and we can have big, honest conversations. And he is, as the Gottmans would say, open to influence. And we both are, right? So it works really well. But just being able to say like, I would like to have this conversation with you where there's an open dialogue to both of us. I don't like it when you cut me off when I'm in the middle of a thought. I don't like it when you sneer at my remarks. I don't like it when you talk down to me as if I'm a child. I'm a grown-up. Let's have a conversation and let's respect and try to understand each other's opinions and instead of trying to force our own on each other. So these would be some boundaries around those intellectual boundaries, learning how to just speak up for yourself in these ways. And for a lot of us, this is not going to be easy, and it's not going to come naturally, and it's not going to be on the tip of our brain or the tip of our tongue. I have so many people that say to me, Julia, I wish I could just pull the words out of your mouth and just like use them. I'm like, I haven't always had these words either. This has been a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of investment and doing this work over a long period of time because I see how valuable it is. And I see how much my anxiety has gone down and my peace of mind has gone up and my sense of self has been kind of created and curated, and just with how much more ease I exist through life from doing this work. And this is why it's so worth it. And so, yeah, just really looking at like communicating these things for those intellectual boundaries. And then our last one is going to be material boundaries. And this might be something that you know that you didn't really know. And as soon as I say it, you're going to be like, oh yeah. And this is one of those ones where you're like, when you share your possessions, you're allowed to have guidelines around them. So you get to decide what and how you lend out your items and how you want them treated, right? And this is a big one, especially with families and money. And I say, have a written agreement. When you're lending money, what is the expectation? Is this a gift or is this a loan? What is the repayment schedule? What is the repayment timeline? What is the repayment expectation? And then everyone is talking about it and signing something. And this isn't about being controlling. Again, boundaries don't mean that I am mean. Boundaries mean that I am clear. And this prevents that breakdown, that resentment, those unspoken rules, the misunderstandings, the frustrations. This is to preserve those relationships. And so again, when it comes to lending out things like your car, someone's like, can I borrow your car? Absolutely. Could you please make sure the tank is filled when you return it? Right? We can have yes and with our boundaries. We can have no and. No, I can't do this, and I can do this. Right? We can have that nuance. We can have those ands in there. So often we think that it has to be a yes or a no, or available or not available, but it doesn't. There can be some kind of considerations of yourself and your preferences within that. You can also say certain things that you don't lend out. I'm sorry, I don't lend that thing out. With my kids, I have some devices that they're allowed to use sometimes. I have an old iPad that's, kind of locked down like Fort Knox, but I can, password a game for 30 minutes, right? Or I can let them, they like to take little videos of stuff they're doing in their room, and I can let them, the whole phone is locked down, but they're allowed to use the camera to take a video. But my rule is they're not allowed to use my work phone. They're not allowed to use my primary phone. They're not allowed to really even touch it because I'm like, there's so much stuff on here that I need protected, that I need to not have messed with, that I need to know where everything is. So you're not like moving around things. Like this is so much of what's keeping this roof over our head, children. No, you may not touch this one.
I think it was so helpful the way that you just not only outlined these different, I guess, domains of boundaries, if you will, but also kind of examples within them. Again, going back to thinking about a client that has not really had the time and space to reflect on this. Like some of those are like, that's groundbreaking, to be able to say no and, or to be able to say yes with, or whatever, to put these limits. And it sounds like the call to clinicians then is really to create the space to have these conversations, to facilitate consideration, awareness, deliberateness, leaving the ultimate control and choice with the client, and in that way, really supporting their self-agency.
Yes. So can I give you another example about this, practically speaking, especially with family stuff, because boundaries come up so much of family of origin stuff, probably I would say more than anything else. It does come up in our, nuclear family, with our partners, with bosses, with friends, but so much of it comes up with our family of origin. So working with a long-term client, as I do have several long-term clients who are adult children of alcoholics, and being invited for holidays, right? And parents have an expectation. Mother has expectation. Mother was the alcoholic, but you have to come and stay at our house. When you come to your hometown, you come and stay at our house. And what she was discovering, that every time she would go and stay at her parents' house for an overnight, some kind of chaos would ensue. Some kind of upset, blow up, underhanded remark, hurtful statement, and she would feel stuck and trapped there. And one time she did leave early and say, I can't do this anymore. I am leaving. But again, it created this split in the relationship. She doesn't want to cut her mother off, even though there's so many things that are unhealthy and dysfunctional that she cannot change about her mother, right? Again, it's not about changing someone else. It's about, what do I need to do to preserve and protect myself in this situation? And one of my favorite quotes is by Prentice Hemphill. And it says that boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And so what we discovered is that her going to stay at her parents' house over the holidays for even an overnight, because it can happen in as little as an overnight, tensions will build, harmful, hurtful things will happen, that this is not a good idea anymore, right? So it's not a black and white, I am never going to spend the holidays with my families. Now it's I'm going to go, and I've decided that 3 days is a reasonable amount of time, because I'm going to go to my hometown. I want to see some friends. I want to see some other people. But me and my husband and our children are going to stay at a hotel, right? And for her, this was like mind blowing. She's like, I never even thought about that. I never even thought that, like, I am a grown up and I am allowed to decide where I want to stay when I am spending my vacation time and my money and, my energy doing something, right? I am allowed to stay somewhere else. And finding that at first her mother, like, obviously, hurt and upset, and why don't you want to stay with us? Why is our house not good enough? And then just explaining, and she was very honest and just saying, Mom, just find that when we are in the same place for extended amounts of time, we get on each other's nerves, we do things differently, their tension builds, and then something ends up happening that is not good for our relationship. Do you see how it's not about othering or blaming? It's just saying dynamics happen that are not good for our relationship. So I am doing this to preserve our relationship. This isn't to punish you. That is to preserve, and also, you don't have to say this out loud, but to preserve my sanity so that I don't cut you off completely, right? This is a relationship protective thing. And so if we could start to see those boundaries like that and talk about it, how this is about preserving me and my mental and emotional space, which is also going to preserve our relationship. And it's also good for you too. Like, let's be honest, and you don't have to deal with a bunch of people in your house for a few days.
We're not going to have a big fight. We're not going to have that big thing that happened, or at least there'll be a less likelihood based on our past experiences. Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. Like, is there a possibility to identify with clients, like what are the potential benefits, not just for you, but also like for the relationship, for the other person? Because I know anyone who's worked with couples and families, like these things are very delicate and they're emotionally loaded and require a lot of thoughtfulness clinically. And so I appreciate what you're saying there about like kind of slowing down and explaining, instead of just this is my boundary, kind of deal with it, and seeing it as an opportunity to help preserve and strengthen the relationship instead of degrade it.
Yeah, it's a bridge. It's about building healthy bridges in relationship, not about creating hostile separation, right? And if we can see boundaries like that, this is to protect and preserve this relationship and my mental health and well-being, right? And that is important, and then that matters, right? But if we can see boundaries as good instead of bad, right? Instead of mean, like this is against someone else. No, this is for us. It's for me and it's for us.
You have introduced so many important concepts here. Julia, what are some of your favorite resources for clinicians who are wanting to think more about how not only potentially their own boundaries, but also like how to work with clients around boundaries?
Okay, of course, The Dance of Anger. This was my mind blow. I want to go back and read it now, 15 years later, and be like, I wonder what connects in here, right? I wonder if it's still, but anyways. So Dance of Anger, absolutely. Boundaries, the Cloud and Townsend book, of course. Such a good one. Such a good one. Anything on codependency. And this book is called The Codependency Recovery Plan. So another really good one with that. And then another really helpful tool. Oh, this is 4 words. I hope you understand. It's so powerful. I will not answer the door when you come to my house unannounced because I find it very jarring and off-putting. And I have a tight schedule. I like to know what's happening. Maybe I'm a little type A and a little bit like rigid like that, but that's who I am. And so I am not going to answer the door because I find it really like throws me off. I hope you understand. I cannot do that this weekend. My schedule is full. I'd love to help you out, but I'm just not able to at this time. I hope you understand. I hope you understand.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And it's just this way of being like, I'm not trying to push you away. I'm trying to preserve me. And I hope you can appreciate that or at least understand it.
Julia, for people who want to learn more about you and your work, what's the best way to do that, or even to get in touch with you, follow you, things like that?
Yeah. So YouTube is a big one. I do a lot of kind of 12 to 20 minute psychoeducational talks for the average person, and also for, there's a lot of stuff there. I have a lot of clinicians that follow me. They're like, I use this with my clients and it was great. So you can just search me, Julia Kristina. You can do Julia Kristina Counseling or just Julia Kristina. They're the black and white videos. You'll find them. There's a lot of them out there. And then also my website is juliakristina.com, Kristina with a K. And then also I teach a lot of these concepts that are good for clinicians and also good for just like the average person. And it's in my book, Drive Your Own Darn Bus. And it's really about, I cover boundaries in here. I cover communication. I cover shame. I cover a lot of like mindset stuff that keeps us stuck and how to get unstuck with that in very accessible and approachable language. So
awesome. Thank you. You have brought up so many important different concepts. Thank you so much for joining us today, Julia. I really appreciate it.
It is my absolute joy.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.